They usually met. It was time to go and meet Zina. They usually met on the other side of the railway bridge on a quiet street in the vicinity of Grunwald, where the massives of the houses, dark crossword puzzles in which not everything was yet filled in by yellow light, were interrupted by waste plots, kitchen gardens, and coal houses, the ciphers and sides of the darkness, a line of Konchievs, where there was, by the way, a remarkable fence made out of another one, which had been dismantled somewhere else, perhaps in another town, and which had previously surrounded the camp of the wandering circus, but the boards had now been placed in senseless order, as if nailed together by a blind man, so that the circus beasts once painted on them and reshuffled during the transit had disintegrated into their component parts. Here there was a leg of a zebra, there a tiger's back, and some animal's haunch appeared next to another creature's reversed paw. Life's promise of a life come had been kept with respect to the fence, but the rupture of the earthly images on it destroyed the earthly value of immortality at night. However, little could be made out of it. While the exaggerated shadows of the leaves nearby there was a street light lay on the boards quite logically in perfect order. This served as a kind of compensation, the more so since it was impossible to transfer them to another place. With the boards having broken up and mixed the pattern, they could only be transferred in toto, together with the whole night. Waiting for her arrival, she was always late, and always came by another road than he. Thus it transpired that even Berlin could be mysterious. Within the lindens bloom, the street light winks. A dark and honeyed hush envelops us. Across the curb one's passing shadow slinks. Across the stump a sable ripples thus. The night sky melts to peach beyond the gate. There water gleams, there Venice vaguely shows. Look at that street, it runs to China straight, and yonder star above Volga grows. Oh, swear to me to put it in your dreams, your trust, and to believe in fantasy alone, and never let your soul in prison rust, nor stretch your arm and say, a wall of stone. She always unexpectedly appeared out of the darkness, like a shadow leaving its kindred element. At first her ankles would catch the light, she moved them close together as she walked along a slender rope. Her summer dress was short, of night's own color, the color of the street lights, the shadows of tree trunks, and of shining pavement, paler than her bare arms and darker than her face. This kind of blank verse block dedicated to Georgy Zhukov. Fedor kissed her on her soft lips. She leaned head for a moment to his collarbone, and then quickly freeing herself, walked beside him, at first with such sorrow on her face as if during their 20 hours of separation an unheard of disaster had taken place. But then little by little she came to herself and now smiled as she never did during the day. What was it about her that fascinated him most of all? Her perfect understanding, the absolute pitch of her instinct for everything that he himself loved? In talking to her one could get along without any bridges, and he would barely have time to notice some amusing feature of the night before she would point it out. And not only was Zina cleverly and elegantly made to measure for him by a very painstaking fate, but both of them forming a single shadow were made to measure of something not quite comprehensible, what wonderful and benevolent and continuously surrounding them. When he had first moved in with the Shigolevs and seen her for the first time, he had the feeling that he already knew a great deal about her, and even her name had been long familiar to him, and of certain characteristics of her life, but until he spoke to her he was unable to make out whence and how he knew it. At first he saw her only at dinner, and he watched her carefully, studying her every movement. She hardly spoke to him, although by certain signs, not so much by the pupils of her eyes as by their luster that seemed slanted at him. He felt that she was noticing every glance of his, and that her movements were restricted by the lightest shrouds of the very impression she was producing on him, and because it seemed completely impossible to him that he should have any part in her life, he suffered when he detected something particularly enchanting in her, and was glad and relieved when he glimpsed some flaw in her beauty. Her pale hair, which radiantly and imperceptibly merged into the sunny air around her head, the light blue vein on her temple, another on her long, tender neck, her delicate hand, her sharp elbow, the narrowness of her hips, the weakness of her shoulders, and the peculiar forward slant of her graceful body, as if the floor over which, gathering speed like a skater, she hastened, was always gently sloping away toward the haven of a chair or table on which lay the object she sought. All this was perceived by him with agonizing distinctness, and then during the day was repeated in an infinity of times in his memory, returning ever more lazily, pallidly, and jerkily, losing life and dwindling as a result of the automatic repetitions in the disintegrating image to a mere sketch broken and blurred, in which nothing of the original life subsisted. But as soon as he saw her again, all this subconscious work directed at the destruction of her image, whose power he feared more and more, went by the board, and beauty again flared forth. her nearness, her frightening accessibility to his gaze, the reconstituted union of all the details. If, during those days, he had had to answer before some pretersensuous court, remember how Goethe had said, pointing with his cane at the starry sky, "There is my conscience," he would scarcely have decided to say that he loved her, for he had long since realized that he was incapable of giving his entire soul to anyone or anything. Its working capital was too necessary for him for his own private affairs, but on the other hand, when he looked at her, he immediately reached, in order to fall off again a minute later, such heights of tenderness, passion, and pity as are reached by few loves. And at night, especially after long periods of mental work, half coming out of sleep not by the way of reason, as it were, but through the back door of delirium, with a mad, long drawn-out rapture, he felt her presence in the room on a camp bed hastily and carelessly prepared by a property man, 2 paces away from him, but while he nursed his excitement and reveled in the temptation and the shortness of the distance, and the heavenly possibilities which incidentally had nothing of the flesh, or rather had some blissful replacement for the flesh, expressed in semi-dreamlike terms, he was enticed back into the oblivion of sleep, whence he hopelessly retreated, thinking he still continued to hold his prize. Actually, she never appeared in his dreams, remaining content to delegate various representatives of hers and confidants, who bore no resemblance to her, but who produced sensations that made a fool of him, to which the bluish dawn was a witness. And then, when waking completely to the sounds of the morning, he immediately landed in the very thick of the happiness sucking at his heart, and it was good to be alive, and there glimmered in the mist some exquisite event which was just about to happen. But once trying to imagine Zina, all he saw was a faint sketch which her voice behind the wall was incapable of igniting with life. An hour or two later he met her at a table, and everything was renewed, and he again understood that without her there would not be any morning mist of happiness. One evening, a fortnight after he had moved in, she knocked on his door with a haughty, resolute step and an almost contemptuous expression on her face, entered, holding in her hand a small volume hidden in a pink cover. "I have a request," she said, briskly and curtly. "Will you sign this for me?" Fedor took the book and recognized in it a pleasantly worn, pleasantly softened up by 2 years of use. This was something quite new to him, copy of his collection of poems. He began very slowly to unstopper his bottle of ink, although at other times, when he wanted to write, the cork would pop out, as that in a bottle of champagne. Meanwhile, Zina, watching his fingers fumbling in the cork, added hastily, "Only your name, please, only your name. F. Goodunov Sherdintsev," signed his name, and was about to put the date, but thought better of it, fearing she might detect in this some vulgar emphasis. "That's fine, thank you," she said, and went out, blowing on the page. The next day but one was Sunday, and around 4, it suddenly became clear that she was alone at home. He was reading in his room. She was in the dining room, and kept making short expeditions from time to time into her room, across the hall, whistling as she went, and in her light, crisp footfalls there was a topographical enigma, since a door from the dining room led straight into her room. "But we are reading, and we will keep on reading. Longer, and for as long as possible shall I be in a strange country, and although my thoughts, my name, my works will belong to Russia, I myself, my mortal organism, will be removed from it." And at the same time, on his walks in Switzerland, the man who could write thus used to strike dead with his cane to the lizards running across his path, "the devil's brood," as he said, with the squeamishness of a Ukrainian and the hatred of a fanatic, and an unimaginable return. "The regime, what do I care? Under a monarchy, flags and drums; under a republic, flags and elections." Again she went by. No reading was out. Too excited, too full of the feeling that another in his place would have sauntered out and addressed her with casual savoir-faire. But when he imagined himself sailing out and butting into the dining room and not knowing what to say, he began to wish that she would soon go out, or that the Shkolevs would come home. And at the very moment when he decided to stop listening and give his undivided attention to Gogol, Fedor quickly got up and went into the dining room. She was sitting by the door to the balcony, and with her gleaming lips half parted, was aiming a thread at a needle. Through the open door one could see the sterile balcony and hear the tinny ringing and clicking of the leaping raindrops. It was a heavy, warm April shower. "Sorry, I didn't know you were here," said mendacious Fedor. "Only wanted to say something about that book of mine. It's not the real thing. The poems are bad. I mean, they're not all bad, but generally speaking, those I've been publishing these last 2 years in the Gazeta are much better." "I liked very much the one you recited that evening of poetry," she said, "the one about the swallow that cried out." "Oh, you were there?" "Yes, but I have even better ones, I assure you." She suddenly jumped up from her chair, threw her darning on the seat, and with her arms dangling, leaned forward, taking quick, small, gliding steps. She sped into her room and returned with some newspaper clippings, his and Konchev's poems. "But I don't think I have everything here," she remarked. "I didn't know that such things happened," said Fedor, and added awkwardly, "Now I'll ask them to make little holes around them with a perforator, like coupons, so that you can tear them out more easily. She continued to busy herself with a stocking stretched over a wooden mushroom, and without lifting her eyes, but smiling quickly and slyly, she said, "I also know that you used to live at 7 Tenneberg Street. I often went there." "You did?" said Fedor, amazed. "I used to know Lorenz's wife in St. Petersburg. She gave me drawing lessons." "How queer," said Fedor. "Romanov is now in Munich," she continued. "A most objectionable character, but I always liked his things." They talked about Romanov and about his pictures. He had reached full maturity, museums were buying his stuff. Having passed through everything, loaded with rich experience, he had returned to an expressive harmony of line. "You know his footballer? There's a reproduction in this magazine. Here it is. The pale, sweaty, tensely distorted face of a player, depicted from top to toe, preparing at full speed to shoot with terrible force at the goal. Tousled red hair, a burst of mud on his temple, the taut muscles of his bare neck, a wrinkled, soaking wet violet singlet, clinging in spots to his body, comes down low over his spattered shorts, and is crossed with the wonderful diagonal of a mighty crease. He is in the act of hooking the ball sideways. One raised hand, with wide splayed fingers, is a participant in the general tension and surge. But most important, of course, are the legs, a glistening white thigh, an enormous scarred knee, boots swollen with dark mud, thick and shapeless, but nevertheless marked by an extraordinarily precise and powerful grace. The stocking has slipped down one vigorously and twisted calf, one foot is buried in rich mud, and the other is about to kick, and how, the hideous tar-black ball, and all this against a dark gray background, saturated with rain and snow. Look at this picture. One could already hear the whiz of leather missile, already see the goalkeeper's desperate dive. "And I know something else," said Zina. "You were supposed to help me with the translation. Jarsky told you about it, but for some reason you didn't turn up." "How queer," repeated Fedor. There was a bang in the hall. That was Mariana Nikolaevna returning, and Zina deliberately got up, gathering the cuttings together, and went to her room. Only later did Fedor understand why she considered it necessary to act that way, but at the moment it seemed to him like a discourtesy. And when Miss Shigolev came into the dining room, the result was as if he had been stealing sugar out of the sideboard.